to the program. Mark, we're talking education.
Yeah, speaking of post-COVID matters, guys, here we have the Brookings Institution, which curiously, like the RAND Corporation, another in-depth think tank, is always taking in-depth looks at our education system here in the States. But anyway, this Brookings posting here, the pandemic has had devastating impacts on learning. What will it take to help students catch up? And what's basically at issue here is that the United States, despite the decades of educational failures, especially in reading and math, still wants to push the conventional education system and add on universal preschool, one of the great fears of the traditional conservative movement. And so there's a divergent path here. And we'll talk about it here. That other path is more of a homeschooling-based approach that the COVID-19 pandemic has enabled. And in fact, it helped the homeschooling industry grow for obvious reasons. So which path will America take? Will it go a more freedom route, or will it go the conventional route with even more institutional failures and universal preschool added on so kids are away from their parents at an even younger age? And we can go through a little bit of the Brookings thing here on the next slide. As we outlined in our new research study released in January, the cumulative impact of COVID, the pandemic on students' academic achievement has been large, and they've been doing a lot of tracking and things like that. So the establishment is saying that COVID really hurt education. And moving on from there, we can read a little bit of the next one. Average fall 2021 math test scores in grades 3 through 8 were 0.20 to 0.27 standard deviations lower relative to the same grade peers in the fall of 2019, while reading test scores were also lower. They're calling it a sizable drop. A major quote there, further achievement tended to drop more between the fall of 2020 and 2021 than between 2019 and 2020, both overall and differentially by school poverty, indicating that disruptions to learning, as the establishment calls it, have continued to negatively impact students well past the initial hits following the spring 2020 school closures. And we can go on from there. Here we have where it gets into the way that the federal government wants this thing to go. And this is from March 9 of this year, 2023. And it says Biden requests $90 billion for education department in fiscal year 24 budget. That's the fiscal year that starts October 1st of this year. And so high poverty schools and special education services would receive the largest K through 12 funding. Special ed services is code for universal preschool. And going on from there, President Joe Biden released an ambitious spending plan for fiscal 24 with $90 billion for the Department of Ed, a 13.6 or $10.8 billion increase over current budget allocations. So they're getting really aggressive about this. At the bottom of this slide here, it says other initiatives include $500 million with an M for a new demonstration program to expand access to free preschool, and $578 million to increase the number of school-based counselors, psychologists, social workers, and other health professionals in K through 12 schools. Very much a socialist, it takes a village approach here to education, and we can go from there. 2 days ahead of the 2-year anniversary of the passage of the American Rescue Plan, which provided the largest one-time fiscal investment in education in response to COVID, with $121.9 billion in funding. That's $121.9 billion. Biden's latest annual budget proposal aims to continue addressing academic recovery efforts, recovering from COVID, and closing the so-called achievement gaps, particularly the $2.2 billion increase in Title I investments. Title I has to do with poverty students, so-called poverty students. And we'll move on from there. They're saying there's some GOP resistance on Capitol Hill. I'm not sure how serious that resistance really is. But what this is amounting to is, as I mentioned on this slide, the Latin phrase in loco parentis, in the place of the parents. That's really where the federal initiative is headed. The budget's $500 million proposal to fund a new initiative for districts to expand free preschool in school and community-based settings puts universal preschool within our reach, quote unquote, said Roberto Rodriguez, the Ed Department's Assistant Secretary for Planning evaluation, and policy development. So the Biden administration is uh, trying, finally trying to achieve the liberal wet dream, you might say, of universal preschool. And there's another slide that kind of cements that idea. We know there is no greater area in education that returns on investment than investing in early childhood education. Rodriguez, the head of the education department, said this new investment builds on the president's plan for a federal state partnership that would support universal free preschool across the nation. And so the federal government's solution to what happened with COVID is more spending, more of the same, and probably more failures, especially in education and math, even while they're claiming they're going to improve those areas. And here in this next slide is a gentleman I met in early 2021 in the Woodlands, Texas, near Houston, at a constitutional sheriff's organization. They had a policy summit there. And this is Michael Peroutka. He ran as a Constitution Party presidential candidate some years back, and he's run for some other offices since. And he has been saying, he's been on the front lines, guys, saying, we had the COVIDocracy, we had the COVID crackdown. We finally got these kids out of these socialist public schools, and now we want to put them back. We've got lots of so-called Republicans and so-called conservatives, Peroutka says. They're saying that, we got to get our kids back in school. We got to get things back to normal. He's saying, stop the presses. We've got the golden chance here to finally break up the public school monopoly, the huge pull it has on property taxes to finance it. We've got a chance at freedom. We've got a chance to break out of the jail. And so Peroutka is saying we've got to take this chance and not allow the federal government to sew this up and add universal preschool, again, getting kids away from their parents at an even younger age. And that'll make a burgeoning homeschool movement a little bit more difficult, even though it is still growing post-COVID. And here we just have some miscellaneous we can look at. This is from Republic Broadcasting, an article where they're saying the unconstitutional impact of the U.S. Department of Ed, detrimental effects on student education. There's the symbol that many people believe the Department of Ed, which was created as a cabinet level department in the late 1970s. They think that agency should be abolished. There was an initial Department of Education early on during Andrew Johnson, way back in the 19th century, but it really never took root very deeply. And there's other things on here. The powers not delegated to the U.S. by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. And that's the 10th Amendment. And Michael Peroutka and others that believe in true educational freedom are calling attention to that. And Ron Paul has been quoted as saying on the floor of Congress in 2001, the former Texas congressman, the Constitution does not even authorize the U.S. Department of Education. So there's a very strong constitutional reason to get rid of the Department of Ed altogether, along with growing the homeschool movement. And this is that other path that we could take. But the Biden administration, of course, wants us to take the bureaucratic socialistic path. And that's the main stuff, Mike, on what's going on there. There's some other things I had about this matter here, and I'll just touch on it briefly. Why Johnny Can't Read. Now, this book came out in 1955, and this fits into what I was saying about how the federal government has been working on failed policies, even going back before the Department of Ed was created. And that has to do with whole language instead of phonics reading. And Why Johnny Can't Read was put out in 1955. And as that slide said, Rudolph Fleisch, the author of Why Johnny Can't Read, still saw no improvements over decades and put out another book called Why Johnny Still Can't Read in 1981. And I could get into the rudiments of how teaching someone to read actually works. We can get into that in extra if you'd like. And there's even another book here in this next slide, Why Johnny Can't Read, Nor Can He Write, Nor Can He Do Math. That's another book that came out. And this is John Saxon in this slide. He was a math pioneer. I met him when I worked for the South Bend, Indiana Tribune. He lived until 1996. He was born in the 1920s. And he had a common sense approach to education that stressed doing an algebra lesson and keep going, but then you would do older lessons to reinforce what you've already learned as you even did the new lessons. And so he had a pioneering way of doing math that's largely been forgotten by the school establishment. So the techniques that could rescue the public school system in the States have been largely ignored. So that's why many are calling for true education freedom rather than a universal preschool lockdown and getting kids away from parents at an ever younger age. So that's kind of what's before the American people right now, and it's not being talked about all that much.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. Thanks, Mark. Okay, let's move on, David, to some economic